You've probably seen pictures of Singapore's Marina Bay Sands, right? It's absolutely iconic. But what you might not know is that behind that incredible design is this wild story of impossible deadlines, some seriously clever innovation, and a near disaster that almost brought the whole thing down. And it all kicked off with one single terrifying flaw. So, picture this. You're years into building one of the most expensive, most complicated buildings ever. The three huge towers are finally standing tall, and you're just about to put the finishing touch on top, this massive SkyPark. And then, your engineers come to you with some bad news. Actually, no, terrible news. They found a problem so big, it could bring the entire structure crashing down. And that was the terrifying question they were facing. What if these three giant skyscrapers could, well, sway? You see, the towers were built as separate structures, so they weren't totally rigid. The engineers figured out that in high winds, they could actually move back and forth. But believe it or not, the swaying itself wasn't even the biggest problem.
Nope, the biggest threat was what was supposed to sit on top of them. We're talking about the SkyPark. And this thing wasn't just some observation deck. It was a 1.5-hectare behemoth. That's almost 4 acres. It had gardens, restaurants, and, oh yeah, a 150-meter-long infinity pool filled with 1.5 million liters of water. And this whole massive thing had to connect 3 towers that, as they just discovered, could all move on their own. So, what was the magic number? 200 millimeters. That was the potential sway. That's about the length of your smartphone. Now, I know what you're thinking. That doesn't sound like a lot, right? But when you're talking about a massive, rigid structure connecting 3 skyscrapers, 200 millimeters is absolutely catastrophic. The consequences? Well, they were just unthinkable. If the towers moved but the SkyPark stayed rigid, all that stress would have nowhere to go. It would crack the concrete, and the first thing to go would be that huge infinity pool. Can you imagine? From there, it could set off a chain reaction of failures, a complete disaster, happening almost 700 feet up in the air. So how on earth did they get into this mess? To really get it, we need to rewind the clock a bit, right back to the start.
Okay, so from the very beginning, Marina Bay Sands was never ever going to be just another building. This was a grand, almost impossibly ambitious vision. The whole idea was to create a new global icon, something that would completely redefine Singapore's skyline. But with that kind of ambition, well, it came with an insane amount of pressure. $8 billion. Let that sink in. To put that in perspective for you, for that same amount of money, you could have built the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, 5 times. So yeah, this wasn't just another big project. This was on a whole other level, financially and in terms of engineering. So who was behind this whole thing? The vision came from the Las Vegas Sands tycoon Shelton Adelson. He went out and hired the legendary architect Moshe Safdie and basically told him, build me something nobody has ever seen before. And Safdie delivered with this just mind-bending design. But there was a catch. Safdie's team looked at the plans and said, okay, this is going to take us about 7 years. Adelson's response? You've got 3. Yeah, so the clock was already ticking like crazy before they even broke ground.
But before they could even dream of building up into the sky, they had a huge problem right under their feet. Turns out the ground they had to build on was, let's just say, not exactly stable. You see, the entire site was built on reclaimed land, which basically means it was full of soft, squishy marine clay. Not exactly what you want to build a multi-billion-dollar complex on. So what did they do? The engineers built this massive concrete wall, 1.5 meters thick, and sunk it 50 meters straight down into the ground. It essentially created this giant, watertight bathtub that held back all the unstable soil so they could safely dig out the bad stuff from inside. Just getting that foundation right took a whole year. All right, foundation's done. Now for the towers themselves, with that incredible curved design. It's kind of wild, right? One side goes straight up and the other side leans out dramatically. They had to build at this insane pace, a whole new floor every 4 days. And to keep the leaning parts from, falling over, they used these temporary steel frames for support. The big moment came at the 23rd floor. That's where the two halves finally met, and they locked them together with this super heavy-duty steel frame. That's what took all the weight and made the 2 separate pieces into one solid tower. So you might be asking, how in the world did they build so much so fast? Well, they had an army, literally. At the project's peak, there were 16,500 people working on that site, day and night in shifts around the clock.
They even had to build the world's largest canteen just to feed everybody. I mean, it was just a monumental human effort. Okay, so fast forward a year and a half of that relentless pace. The three towers are up, they're standing tall, and this is where we come full circle, right back to that crisis we talked about at the beginning. The horrifying late-game discovery that these beautiful, almost finished towers had a fundamental flaw, one that could literally tear them apart, starting from the very top.
So, to make sure they weren't just being paranoid, they built a scale model and blasted it with a simulated typhoon inside a wind tunnel. And the tests, well, they confirmed their worst fears. That 200-millimeter sway, it was real. The team was staring down a flaw that could kill the entire project.
Can you just imagine how that must have felt? After all that work, all those sleepless nights, with the finish line right there in front of you, and now this? But like one of the lead engineers said, it was not an option to break and rebuild the entire structure once again. Tearing it all down wasn't just financially impossible, it was emotionally impossible. They were in too deep. They had to find a way to innovate their way out of this. And the solution they came up with was brilliant. It actually came from a totally different area of engineering, building bridges. They designed this system of massive movement joints. So, here's the clever part. Instead of rigidly bolting the SkyPark to the towers, they basically made it float on top. These huge bearings would let the towers sway around underneath, completely independent of each other, while the SkyPark itself stays nice and stable. It was designed to absorb up to 250 millimeters of movement, which was even more than they needed for a worst-case scenario. Okay, so crisis averted, but they weren't done yet, not by a long shot. They still had one final colossal challenge to deal with. How in the world do you lift something the size of an aircraft carrier and put it on top of three towers, almost 700 feet in the air?
1,400 tons. That's how much the steel frame for the SkyPark weighed. To give you an idea of what that's like, imagine listing two of the world's biggest cargo planes and just gently placing them on top of these skyscrapers. Yeah, this was something nobody had ever really done before. Obviously, they couldn't lift it all in one go, so the plan was to do it in 14 huge sections. Each individual lift was this incredibly slow, careful process that took 16 hours. And the whole time, they were fighting against the weather. A sudden storm rolling in from the sea could turn one of these 100-ton steel segments into a giant, catastrophic wrecking ball. But against all odds, piece by piece, they carefully hoisted every segment up, slowly assembling the incredible SkyPark, right there in the sky. So they'd beaten the unstable ground, they'd solved the mystery of the swaying towers, and now, after battling through every single impossible challenge thrown their way, the project was, at last, complete. It ended up finishing a year behind that crazy 3-year schedule, but who cares? It was a stunning triumph. Today, Marina Bay Sands is so much more than a hotel or a casino. It's really a symbol of what's possible when people with incredible ingenuity and creativity just refuse to give up. The building you see is magnificent for sure, but the real story, the best story, is in all that invisible engineering that turned a near-certain disaster into one of the world's most iconic buildings. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. The story of Marina Bay Sands is just epic, right? But it makes you wonder, how many other things out there have stories like this? The bridges you cross, the tunnels you drive through, even the buildings you walk into every single day. How many of them have their own hidden tales of a crisis that was avoided because of some genius solution? What invisible engineering marvels are holding our world together right under our noses?